He boarded the 6:30 train. He never got off. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallo. This channel thrives on your support. Let me know where you're listening from today. Your messages are always a highlight of my day. Let's get into it. It was precisely 6:32 p.m. when the 6:30 express from King's Cross shuddered to a halt beneath the soot-darkened canopy of Levenham Junction, 2 minutes late, a fact noted with disapproval by the tall man in the grey Homburg hat, who stood on the platform with the air of someone not accustomed to waiting. The train hissed in protest as doors clattered open, luggage was hoisted down, and passengers spilled onto the chilly platform. Among the disembarking crowd was a woman in a smart lilac travelling coat, her gloves clutched tightly in one hand, her expression taut. She walked briskly, eyes scanning the platform as if expecting someone. Just behind her, a younger woman with a bobbed chestnut fringe and striking green scarf hopped down with a satchel slung over her shoulder, humming a tune quite out of step with the tension already brewing in the station air. At the far end of the platform, in compartment C2 of carriage 4, a conductor knocked twice and slid open the door with a cheerful, "End of the line, sir." There was no response. "Sir?" he repeated, stepping inside. It was a moment before anyone noticed the commotion. The conductor had frozen, staring at the slumped figure of a man in the corner seat. A well-dressed gentleman, 50-ish, with a crimson handkerchief still half tucked into his jacket pocket. He might have appeared to be asleep, except for the unnatural tilt of his head and the widening pool of blood at his collar. "Good Lord," the conductor whispered, staggering back. A whistle blew. Shouts rang out. The lilac-coated woman dropped her gloves. Within moments, the news spread along the platform like a wildfire through dry brush. There had been a murder aboard the 6:30 from King's Cross. By the time the local constable arrived, followed shortly by Inspector Lomax of the Levenham Police, the platform was cordoned off, and the passengers still present had been ushered into the waiting room. The deceased was quickly identified. Mr. Arthur Peregrine, a barrister of some repute, en route to visit his sister in Leeds. He had boarded the train at King's Cross alone. No one had entered or exited his compartment between departure and arrival, or so it seemed. The circumstances were unnerving. No weapon was found, no sign of struggle. His overcoat was neatly folded beside him, and his briefcase lay untouched at his feet. The door had been locked from the inside, window bolted. The only mark of violence, a single puncture wound to the side of the neck, delivered with surgical precision. "A suicide," someone murmured, but Inspector Lomax shook his head grimly. "A man cannot stab himself in the neck from behind and lock the door after falling." Dead. An hour later, with the evening fog curling at the platform edge and the passengers still murmuring uneasily in the station café, a sleek black motor car pulled up just beyond the constable's barricade. Out stepped a compact man with an impressive moustache and a pair of faultlessly polished patent leather shoes. His grey suit was without wrinkle, his silk scarf precisely arranged. He surveyed the station with fastidious calm. He turned to the tall man beside him, none other than Captain Hastings. "Mon ami," Hercule Poirot said, "shall we?" Earlier that day, Poirot and Hastings had been lunching at the Savoy. Poirot's mood one of unusual levity. He had, he claimed, solved 3 crossword puzzles in a single morning, and was debating whether to retire permanently to the countryside for the peace of cabbages and hens. That was when the telephone call came, a hushed, urgent message from Scotland Yard. "A man has been murdered on the King's Cross Leeds Express," the voice had said. "In a locked compartment. No weapon, no suspect. Superintendent Blake suggested you might be intrigued." "Ah," Poirot had murmured, setting down his demi-tasse with a delicate clink. "The locked room. Always it returns like an old acquaintance, charming and full of mischief." Now, in the cool air of Levenham Junction, Poirot paced the length of the train, pausing at the marked compartment. He stepped inside with his usual precision, his gaze sweeping across the scene. He examined the body, the untouched briefcase, the pressed crease of the dead man's trousers. He sniffed the air. He bent to inspect the lock. He touched nothing, and yet saw everything. Finally he spoke. "You will forgive me, Inspector Lomax, but this—" he tapped his temple. "This is not the work of passion. It is the work of calculation." The inspector frowned. "You mean premeditated?" Poirot's eyes glittered. "Mais oui, but more than that. It is theatre. Observe. A respectable gentleman, a sealed compartment, an apparently impossible crime. This is not just murder, my friend. It is a message." Hastings blinked. "A message to whom?" Poirot straightened, smoothing his lapel. "To whomever it was intended for. And I believe, mon cher Hastings, that before long, that person will reveal themselves." Elsewhere in the station, the passengers who had shared the train ride were beginning to grow restless. Some demanded to leave, others refused to speak. There was Mrs. Lillian Peregrine, the dead man's estranged sister, who had not seen Arthur in 6 years, but had, quite coincidentally, booked a compartment on the same train. There was Miss Sylvia Darrow, the young secretary, whose handbag contained an envelope addressed to Mr. Peregrine, unopened. There was Colonel Hugh Rathbone, who had briefly shared a cigar with the victim in the first class, smoking lounge, and who claimed to have seen nothing, heard nothing, known nothing. There was even Mr. Jasper Monckton, a bookish solicitor with too much sweat on his brow and an oddly urgent desire to leave the station. Each had boarded the 6:30 from King's Cross. Each had seen the victim at some point during the journey, and each, Poirot quietly noted, was lying, if not by word, then certainly by omission. He glanced once more at the small, bloodied handkerchief still visible in the dead man's pocket, monogrammed in faint gold thread, not with the victim's initials, but with someone else's. Poirot did not yet speak of this. Not yet. Instead, he turned to Inspector Lomax with the faintest smile. "I suggest we do not detain the passengers too long this evening," he said. "No, let them go. Let them believe the danger is past." "But we're no closer to the truth," the inspector began. Poirot held up a hand. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, monsieur. We are always closer to the truth than we think. One must only know where to look." He paused, eyes narrowing toward the waiting room, where the suspects had been gathered, and where, like pawns before a game of chess, they waited to be moved. And when to strike. The waiting room at Levenham Junction smelled faintly of wet coats and coal smoke. A single gas lamp sputtered overhead, casting flickering shadows on the pale blue walls. Poirot, his hands neatly clasped behind his back, entered without a word, allowing the weight of silence to precede him. 6 passengers sat inside, each occupying a different chair, as though the very thought of proximity to the others was distasteful. Their expressions were a tapestry of weariness, irritation, and, in more than one case, something Poirot recognized at once as fear, disguised by composure. He surveyed them quietly, then gave a small bow. "Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for your patience," he began in his gently accented English. "It is most regrettable, the interruption to your journey. But a man has died, and it is necessary that I, Hercule Poirot, ask a few questions. Not as accusations, no, only as clarifications." They shifted in their chairs. Poirot turned first to the tall, angular woman in the lilac coat, who sat stiffly by the radiator, her hands folded tight in her lap. "You are Madame Peregrine, the sister of the deceased." Her lips tightened. "Lillian Peregrine." "Yes." "You were also travelling to Leeds?" She nodded. "My husband and I own a small property in Ilkley. I intended to meet Arthur. We had not seen one another in some time." And how long had it been precisely? Poirot asked, head tilted just slightly. She looked away. 6 years. Yet you travelled on the same train, at the same hour, and did not enter his compartment? We were not close. Poirot offered a gentle smile. No? That is curious. Often when one is estranged, one becomes especially interested in the habits and movements of the other. One watches from afar. Her mouth thinned. I kept to myself. I didn't even know he was on the train until the commotion began. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, madame. You are most helpful. He turned now to the young woman in the green scarf, who had been watching Poirot with open interest. She looked clever, perhaps too clever, and when she smiled, it was the kind of smile one gave to a cat, not a detective. And you, mademoiselle, your name? Sylvia Darrow, she said lightly. I'm Mr. Peregrine's secretary. Indeed? A woman so young in so professional a position. That is admirable. And were you travelling to Leeds also? She nodded, brushing a strand of chestnut hair from her brow. He had a family matter, some legal concerns with his sister's estate, I think. He wanted me to bring the paperwork and keep things in order. Poirot gave her a long, quiet look. And what was your relationship with him, Mademoiselle Darrow? Strictly professional. She laughed, a little too quickly. Of course. Poirot's eyes dropped to her handbag, which she now clutched more tightly. He did not comment, but filed the gesture away. You spoke to him on the train? No, she said quickly. I boarded separately. We were supposed to meet after arrival. He had a private compartment. Indeed. And tell me, did he ever receive your letter? Her lips parted slightly. What letter? The one in your handbag. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then smiled. Ah, that. No, I didn't get the chance. It was personal. Poirot offered a small bow of his head. I understand. Perhaps later, if you wish, you may allow me to read it. Before she could reply, Poirot had already shifted his attention to the tall, ruddy-faced man at the back of the room, Colonel Rathbone, moustached and scowling, with a cane laid across his knees. You are the Colonel, yes? Hugh Rathbone? I am, retired. Poirot smiled. But not inactive, I suspect. Tell me, you shared a cigar with Mr. Peregrine during the journey? Rathbone shrugged. Briefly, in the smoking lounge, carriage 1, first class. And what did you discuss? Politics. The state of the railways. Nothing important. No raised voices? Not from me. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Ah, then someone else raised their voice. Rathbone's brow twitched. I didn't say that. Non, monsieur, but you implied it. Who then raised their voice? The Colonel hesitated. There was a man. I didn't catch his name. Young. Wore glasses. Burst in halfway through our conversation, red in the face. He said something about what was owed, and then left just as quickly. Poirot glanced at Hastings, who made a brief note. Merci. And this man, you saw him board? Number he seemed to come from further back. In the train, Poirot nodded and approached the final 2 passengers. The first was a thin, pale man in wire-rimmed spectacles, Jasper Monckton, the solicitor, who had said almost nothing thus far. His collar was damp with sweat, despite the chill in the room. Mr. Monckton, Poirot said. You were also in first class? I was in third, the man corrected quickly. I don't usually travel so luxuriously, Monsieur Poirot, but the ticket was provided. Provided by whom? Mr. Peregrine, he said with difficulty. He asked me to come to Leeds on legal business. Ah, so you also were employed by him? Temporarily. There was a discrepancy in an old case. Something about inheritance fraud. He wanted my advice. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And did this discrepancy involve his sister? Monckton swallowed. I don't know. Poirot did not press further. Not yet. Finally he turned to the last occupant, a young porter in uniform, his cap in his hands, clearly anxious to leave. "You are Alfred Griggs, no? The train porter?" "Yes, sir." "You saw Mr. Peregrine during the journey?" "Aye. I checked compartments after York. He was asleep, or seemed to be. Door locked. Shade half down." "You saw anyone else near his compartment?" Griggs frowned. "Well, come to think of it, a woman passed me in the corridor not long before we reached Levenham. She was in grey, walking fast, had a little perfume about her, sort of sharp." Poirot gave a slight nod. "Merci, monsieur." He stood in the centre of the room, arms lightly folded. He had now seen them all, heard their stories, watched their eyes, and each, in their own way, had betrayed something. A glance too long, a pause too measured, a silence too careful. "Mes amis," Poirot said at last, "you will be pleased to hear that I shall not detain you further tonight. The Levenham Constabulary will take your statements once more for record, but I ask only this, that no one leaves the county for 48 hours. A murmur of protest swept the room. Poirot smiled gently. "Do not concern yourselves. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear, but someone among you knows." He turned without another word, gesturing for Hastings to follow. As they stepped into the corridor once more, Hastings said in a low voice, "You believe one of them did it?" Poirot didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly toward the train, where the compartment still waited in quiet reverence, the body now removed. At last Poirot said, "It was not a random act, Hastings. This was crafted, as precise as a scalpel in a surgeon's hand. There is blood, yes, but it was never about the blood. It is always about the motive, and the motive—" He paused, gazing out at the lengthening night. "Is not yet complete." And in the silence that followed, something shifted in Poirot's gaze, something sharper than suspicion. It was calculation. The first step in a game only he knew how to finish. The morning mist clung low across the hedgerows as Poirot and Hastings arrived at the modest inn where the principal witnesses had been housed overnight. It was a quiet establishment, the Briar Rose, with ivy along the windows and a creaking front gate that announced each visitor. Poirot had insisted they remain close by, not out of mere suspicion, but because he knew proximity bred pressure, and pressure often revealed the seams in a lie. Inside the parlour, breakfast was being served on a long oak table. Miss Darrow nursed a cup of tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the delicate porcelain. Colonel Rathbone sat reading a local newspaper, though his eyes seemed fixed on the same sentence. Jasper Monckton had not come down. Lillian Peregrine sat stiff-backed near the fire, her lilac coat now replaced by a dark wool shawl. Her eyes, Poirot noted, had been crying, but not recently. He paused by the doorway for a moment, adjusting the crisp fold of his cuffs. No one noticed him. That, too, he took as a sign. People lied more easily when they believed themselves unwatched. "I think we shall begin with conversation, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "Not interrogation. No, this morning we stir the waters gently." They stepped inside. Hastings made a small cough of greeting, which drew the room's attention. Poirot smiled warmly. "Ah, mes amis, a bonne matinée, n'est-ce pas? The country air, it clears the mind, and the coffee here, I am told, is at least half tolerable." Colonel Rathbone grunted, folding his newspaper with slow precision. "Detective, you've come early." Poirot nodded. "Indeed, Colonel. Forgive the interruption, but I hope to ask one or two little questions, merely to clarify small points, you understand. We must be thorough. It is the only way to find the truth." He turned first to Miss Darrow. "Mademoiselle, this letter you were carrying for Mr. Peregrine. Might I see it now?" Sylvia hesitated, then reached into her satchel. She produced the envelope, but before releasing it, she said, "He never read it. It was personal. Nothing about business or the will or anything like that." "I understand," Poirot said gently. "May I?" She handed it over. Poirot turned it over carefully in his hands. The envelope was unsealed. He opened it with slow, almost reverent precision. The letter inside was brief, written in a looping, somewhat hurried hand. "Arthur, if you're truly going to confront her, then I must say this now. I never believed the story about the loan. I think she lied. You were right to suspect the discrepancy. But if you press it, she won't forgive you. And I think she's more dangerous than you realize." Poirot folded it neatly and returned it. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have confirmed something I suspected." "What's that?" she asked. "That there is a woman in this story who knows how to wound with silence." He turned smoothly, as though that answer were enough, and approached Lilian Peregrine by the fire. She did not look up. "You cared for your brother, madam?" She nodded slowly. "We weren't close, but I never wanted him dead." "That is not what I asked," Poirot said softly. She looked up now, eyes sharp. "I cared for him once, but he ruined too many things. He treated our father's estate like his personal game board. He cut off my trust income during the war, said it was misallocated funds, said I was living too richly for someone who had not earned it." She gave a bitter laugh. "Imagine!" Poirot tapped his chin lightly. "And did you contest it legally?" "I tried. He made it disappear, or said it never existed. A clerical error, according to the solicitor. Monckton." "Ah," Poirot said. "So you and Mr. Monckton are also acquainted?" "He was our father's legal adviser, then Arthur's, then no one's. Arthur dismissed him last month, quietly." That last word settled in the air like an ash. Poirot thanked her with a small bow and turned to the stairs, leaving the others in a murmur of low conversation. "Upstairs, Hastings," he said as they ascended, "to speak with our disappearing solicitor." They found Jasper Monckton seated at a desk in his room, surrounded by open folders and a small leather valise. He jumped when they entered. "Monsieur Monckton," Poirot said warmly, "what is this you do?" I was organizing my notes," the man stammered. "I assumed I might be asked for records. I thought I'd get ahead of it." "How admirable," Poirot said. "And yet, a man does not sweat so freely from mere industry." Monckton wiped his brow. "What is it you want, Monsieur Poirot?" "The truth, naturally, but more immediately, the nature of your last consultation with Mr. Peregrine. What did he uncover?" Monckton hesitated. There was a second ledger. It came to light in June. Peregrine believed it showed evidence that the inheritance funds due to his sister had been funneled into an anonymous offshore trust. The signatures matched, but there was no trail. He was convinced someone had falsified the entries to erase Lilian's share. Poirot's expression darkened. "And you agreed?" "At first I thought it was an accounting error, but then I wasn't so sure." "Did you tell Mr. Peregrine this?" "Yes, and he was furious. Said he'd confront whoever was responsible. I asked him to wait, to give me time to verify." "And did he?" Monckton shook his head. "He said he didn't trust anyone anymore. That's why he dismissed me." Poirot looked to the valise. "May I see what's inside?" Monckton hesitated, then opened it. Inside were several documents, estate papers, legal correspondence, and a small black notebook. Poirot lifted it, flipping carefully through the pages. Inside were fragments of calculations, initials, dates. Some had been underlined. Others had question marks beside them. On one page, a simple note had been circled twice. "Ask Rathbone, where is 1947 check?" Poirot's brow lifted. "Curious?" He replaced the book. "Thank you, Monsieur Monckton. You have been most enlightening." Back downstairs, Poirot paused outside the inn's conservatory, looking out at the gravel drive. Hastings stepped beside him. "You think the Colonel lied?" "I think the Colonel concealed," Poirot said. "But lies are like ink in water. They drift, stain, then settle. Give them time, and they shape themselves." He glanced across the garden where the Colonel now paced, pipe lit, eyes hard and staring. "We must speak with Rathbone again," Poirot said, "and this time with no distractions." They waited until mid-morning, when the guests dispersed and the Colonel remained alone on the veranda. Poirot approached him with the careful neutrality of a man adjusting a chess piece. "Colonel," he said, "you have known the Peregrines for many years?" Rathbone nodded. "Served with their father in Burma. Arthur and I kept in touch." "And did Arthur ever confide in you about matters of money?" Rathbone exhaled smoke. He had suspicions. About Monkton, said funds were being hidden, but I told him not to chase ghosts. "And did he listen?" "He never listened, not fully." Poirot looked at him for a long time. "And if I were to tell you that a cheque dated 1947, tied to those missing funds, had your name on it?" The Colonel's jaw tightened. His fingers flexed around the pipe. "Then I'd say it was forged." "But you would not be surprised?" Rathbone's eyes narrowed. "I've done nothing illegal." "Perhaps not, but perhaps you were persuaded to be silent when a louder voice was needed. Silence, Colonel, can be the most damning accomplice." Poirot turned before the man could respond. As they walked back toward the car, Hastings finally asked the question that had hung in the air since dawn. "So, where does that leave us?" Poirot gave a tight smile. "Closer, mon ami. Much closer. The inheritance, the offshore trust, the falsified ledger, and now a single cheque that may prove to be the loose thread." He looked back once toward the inn. And, as every tailor knows, when one pulls the loose thread, the entire suit begins to unravel. Back at Levenham Junction that afternoon, the sky hung low with the kind of grey that made shadows blur, and time seemed suspended. Poirot stood once again on the platform beside the silent compartment, where Arthur Peregrine had died. The train had long since been detached and moved to a siding, sealed off by local constables under Poirot's direction. A single lantern flickered just outside the coach, casting a golden oval on the gravel. The crime scene, untouched since the night before, still held its secrets. But secrets, Poirot often said, were most obliging when treated with patience. He stepped inside with Hastings following, careful not to disturb the delicate layer of dust along the corridor floor. Poirot's eyes moved slowly over the interior, the carriage walls, the neatly folded overcoat, the monogrammed handkerchief still resting half obscured in the corner of the seat. Every detail, every angle he re-examined, as if the room might confess something it had not the first time. "Anything new?" Hastings asked quietly, not wishing to interrupt the rhythm of Poirot's concentration. Poirot did not answer at once. He moved to the compartment door and knelt to examine the brass latch. He gently tested the lock again. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small folding ruler. With exacting care, he measured the distance from the seat to the door, from the seat to the opposite window, and finally from the floor to the wound location noted in the coroner's report. When he stood again, his eyes were brighter. "Hastings," he said, "have you ever considered how curious it is that a man can be killed in a locked compartment with no sign of entry or exit, and yet the method does not match the surroundings?" "I suppose it's curious," Hastings admitted. "But what do you mean exactly?" Poirot adjusted his tie. This man was stabbed, not once, not wildly, but with a deliberate puncture, precise and quiet. The angle was from behind and slightly to the left. Such a wound is difficult to deliver unless the victim is unaware and seated, or unless the assailant had access for longer than a passing moment. Hastings frowned. "But if the door was locked?" "Ah, precisely. Either the door was locked after the fact, or the killer was already inside. Hastings stared. You think the killer was hiding in the compartment? Perhaps. Or perhaps something even more clever. But let us not run ahead. Let us ask what else does not fit. Poirot gestured to the handkerchief. It is not his. The monogram reads E.D., and it was not clutched in the hand. It was placed in view, as though it were meant to be found. He turned to the window. And this, too. The window is locked, yet there are faint streaks on the outer glass. Not from rain. From fingers, Hastings. Someone gripped this pane. Not from the inside, but from the outside. Hastings blinked. But that's impossible. The train was moving. Poirot tapped the glass. Was it? You assume the entire journey was without pause. But what if, and consider this carefully, what if the train slowed briefly at an unscheduled stop? Or if someone boarded between stations? Boarded a moving train? Hastings looked incredulous. Or left it, Poirot murmured. They stepped back into the corridor, and Poirot asked to see the conductor. Minutes later, the same middle-aged porter, Alfred Griggs, arrived, hat in hand, nervous under the detective's gaze. "Sir?" "Tell me, monsieur," Poirot said gently. "Do you recall any unusual stops between King's Cross and Levenham?" The porter hesitated. "Well, now that you say it, we did slow down near Market Denley. Some signal trouble, I think, but we never fully stopped." "Slowed? To how much?" "Hard to say, sir. Slow enough to open a door, maybe." Poirot's eyes narrowed. Were any exterior doors unlatched at that point? Griggs paled. "There was one. Rear carriage. I remember locking it myself afterward. Thought some careless passenger might have tampered with it." "Merci, monsieur. You have been most helpful." As the porter left, Hastings turned, his brow furrowed. "Are you saying someone boarded the train through the back while it was moving?" "I am saying," Poirot replied calmly, "that we must now consider the possibility that not everyone who was on that train was on the passenger manifest." They returned to the waiting room, where Sylvia Darrow and Lillian Peregrine had taken tea. The colonel was out walking the lane, and Monckton had left for the police station to deliver documents. Poirot crossed to the small sideboard and poured himself a cup of weak coffee, then turned to Miss Darrow. "Mademoiselle, forgive me. One more question. This letter you wrote to Mr. Peregrine, it warned him of danger, no?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." "You wrote that you believed she had lied. Did you mean his sister?" A pause. "No," Sylvia said quietly. "I meant someone else. A woman named Eleanor Durand. She used to work with Arthur years ago. She was a bookkeeper, discreet, very clever. Too clever. He dismissed her after something went missing. Funds, I think." Poirot's voice sharpened. "And you believe she's involved now?" "I don't know. Arthur had been receiving anonymous letters. He showed me one. Vague threats, allusions to betrayal. But the signature, it was just E.D. Bon," Poirot said softly. "Then I believe we must meet Mademoiselle Durand." Hastings looked up. "But where would she be?" Poirot set his cup down. "If she is clever, as you say, she is nearby, watching, waiting, perhaps even already among us." They made their way to the local telegraph office, where Poirot requested records of train tickets purchased in the last 2 days under names beginning with Durand. The clerk, after much shuffling of pages, produced a small slip. "Eleanor Durand, ticket purchased yesterday at 12:06 p.m. from King's Cross to Market Denley. First class, no return ticket." "Merci," Poirot said, eyes glinting. They returned quickly to the inn, where Poirot summoned Inspector Lomax. Within the hour, a young constable arrived breathless with word. A woman answering Durand's description had been seen renting a room above a tobacconist's shop near the station. The room was empty now, but a grey coat, faint traces of perfume, and a half-burnt matchbook from the Briar Rose had been left behind. Poirot stood quietly in the room, his hands folded. "She came here not to visit," he said, "but to observe." She boarded the train briefly, just long enough to commit the act. She knew the compartment. She knew the man. She left the handkerchief deliberately. "But why?" Hastings asked. "To incriminate herself?" "Non," Poirot said. "To leave a signature, a challenge." Hastings swallowed. "Then she means to strike again." Poirot looked toward the window. "She already has. And if I am not mistaken, the next move will not be subtle." The next morning brought a quiet dread to the inn, the sort that hummed just beneath the surface of ordinary activity. Sylvia Darrow declined breakfast. Colonel Rathbone had left before dawn on a walk that had stretched suspiciously past 2 hours. Monckton returned from the police station, pale and stiff-lipped, and Lillian Peregrine, ever composed, sat in the drawing-room, staring into an empty fireplace, as though waiting for something to catch flame. Poirot remained unhurried. He had risen early, walked the gardens with a small notebook in hand, and returned with a contented expression that Hastings recognized as the calm before one of his mental storms broke loose. "Do you recall, Hastings," he said, as they sat alone in the study, "what I told you at the beginning, that the murder aboard the 6:30 train was more than a crime, that it was a message?" "I remember," Hastings replied, though he still struggled to see how the message had been delivered, let alone to whom. Poirot stood, brushing a speck of lint from his cuff. "Consider this. Eleanor Durand disappears from Peregrine's professional life years ago under a cloud of suspicion. Funds missing, trusts manipulated. Then, years later, she returns, not to explain, not to plead, but to leave her initials on a dead man's handkerchief." "You believe she committed the murder?" Hastings asked. Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, mon ami, she is certainly involved. But whether she wielded the blade herself, I do not yet know. What is certain is that she orchestrated the scene, and she left one very specific clue behind, beyond the handkerchief, beyond the wound." He opened his notebook and turned it toward Hastings. A name had been written across the page, not Eleanor Durand, but another. Penelope Rathbone. Hastings frowned. "Colonel Rathbone's daughter?" "Oui, though she does not use the family name. She has not, in fact, for almost a decade. The Colonel has never spoken of her, but records show she was a clerk in a London firm, the same firm where Eleanor Durand was briefly employed." Hastings' eyes widened. "You think Penelope and Eleanor are connected?" Poirot gave a tight smile. "They were flatmates, and according to city records, joint signatories on a private account that received regular deposits over 5 years from an anonymous holding company based in Cyprus, the same destination, you will recall, as the offshore trust tied to Lillian's vanished inheritance." Hastings sat back. "So, Penelope, Eleanor, and the Colonel's silence, it's all tied to the missing estate money?" "Not merely missing," Poirot said. "Misappropriated, hidden, quietly laundered through ghost accounts. Peregrine discovered this, too late, and prepared to expose it. That was the motive. But the method, that is where the mind of Mademoiselle Durand is so very theatrical." There was a knock at the door. Inspector Lomax entered, hat in hand. "We've located her," he said. "Durand. Found her renting a cottage under the name Ellie Penrose, just outside of Nelby village. She wasn't there, but the landlady said she left only yesterday. Left behind a case." Poirot extended a hand. "May I?" Lomax placed the worn leather case on the table. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside were 3 ledgers, a fountain pen, a pair of wire-framed spectacles, and a torn page from a railway timetable. A penciled mark circled the 6:30 from King's Cross. Poirot tapped the page. "She was watching Peregrine, planning, but look here." He pointed to a handwritten note in the margin. "He won't be alone. She'll come. Must be before Leeds." "She?" Hastings asked. Who is she? Poirot didn't answer immediately. His gaze had gone distant. Then he turned to Lomax. Call the station master at Market Denley. Ask whether anyone matching Eleanor Durand's description boarded the train briefly that evening. We did, Lomax said. She was seen on the tracks by a freight worker, just outside the yard perimeter. She slipped between the coaches as the train slowed. Just as I thought, Poirot murmured. But that still doesn't explain how she got into a locked compartment, Hastings pressed, or how she left without anyone noticing. Poirot held up a hand. She did not need to enter. She opened the window from outside. Remember the handprint? She had only seconds, but she knew where Peregrine sat. A quick jab with a thin blade, then the drop of the monogrammed clue, and she was gone before anyone knew the train had slowed. And the key? Lomax asked. The compartment was locked from the inside. Poirot smiled faintly. Arthur Peregrine had a peculiar habit. According to Miss Darrow, he often locked his door the moment he sat down, and never reopened it until arrival. It was a locked room, but not a sealed one. Hastings exhaled. Good Lord. Durand wanted us to believe it was a puzzle, Poirot said. But it was a performance. She left the name, the hint. And now... He turned back to the case and opened one final pocket. Inside was a small photograph. A woman in a smart suit. Standing beside her, Penelope Rathbone. Poirot looked up. At Lomax. Issue a search for Penelope Rathbone, also known as Penelope Vane. She may be in danger, or part of this deception. Either way, she is the next step. As the inspector left, Poirot turned to Hastings once more. We are now dealing with two minds, Hastings. Eleanor is the architect, meticulous, sharp. But Penelope, she is the thread that connects family to betrayal. And I fear that whichever role she played, pawn or partner, her time is running out. The phone on the study wall rang shrilly, and Poirot crossed the room to answer it. Oui, this is Poirot. He listened, eyes narrowing. I see, he said. Yes, lock down the premises. No one is to leave. He set the phone down. Hastings rose. What is it? Poirot turned, his voice low. Penelope Rathbone has just been found, in the woods behind the Briar Rose Inn. Hastings felt his stomach drop. Dead? Poirot's gaze did not waver. Alive, but barely, and in her hand was a letter addressed to me. Penelope Rathbone lay unconscious in a private room above the apothecary's on Levenham Lane, where the village doctor had hurriedly brought her. Her face was drawn, pale against the white linen, a small bruise just beneath her jaw. Her clothes were damp and torn, as though she had run through brush or fallen, but she was breathing. The doctor said she had suffered a blow, not fatal, but enough to rob her of time and clarity. A struggle, perhaps. A warning, more likely. Poirot sat beside the narrow bed, the note she had clutched now resting in his gloved hand. He had not opened it yet. He simply studied the paper, its rough edge, the hurried fold, the ink that had blotted slightly at the corners. She meant for you to read it, Hastings said quietly. Even now. Oui, Poirot murmured. But there is power in waiting, Hastings. A message unopened still holds its mystery. Once read, it demands response. He waited a moment longer, then unfolded the page. Monsieur Poirot, if this reaches you, then I've either been braver than I imagined, or terribly careless. Eleanor is not what she pretends. She's never forgotten what Arthur did to her, how he ruined her reputation, stole her work, and left her with nothing. She's been planning this for years. But it's not just revenge. It's about the money, too. Always was. My father, he knew. He helped her once. A check, a signature, a silence. He thought it would disappear, but it didn't. And now it's come back. Eleanor will not stop. Not with Arthur. Not with me. She thinks I betrayed her. I tried to walk away. I did. But it's too late now. There are documents in the red tin at the stationmaster's cottage in Market Denley. She made me hide them there. You'll understand everything once you read them. I'm sorry for my part. I only wanted to be free. There was no signature. Poirot read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it into his breast pocket. His face, as always, revealed little, but Hastings could see something shifting beneath the surface. Not alarm exactly, but the tightening of pieces in a puzzle long suspected, but now snapping into place. "She's telling the truth," Hastings said. "Oui," Poirot replied. "And also, she is lying." Hastings blinked. "Lying." "By omission," Poirot said. "Penelope wants redemption, but she will not expose the full depth of her complicity. Not yet, perhaps not ever, but this—" he tapped the letter. "This gives us direction." An hour later, under light rain and with Inspector Lomax in tow, Poirot arrived at the station-master's cottage in Market Denley. It was a squat brick house behind the signal box, the front garden overtaken by overgrown rose bushes and rusted tools. The station-master, a thin, sleepy-eyed man named Withers, opened the door with visible reluctance. Poirot was precise. "A red tin box was placed here, by a young woman, under false pretenses. We require it now." Withers looked stricken. "It's under the floorboards," he said simply. "She said it was personal papers, nothing to do with you lot. Paid me to keep it quiet." Lomax waved the constable forward, and moments later they had retrieved it, an old biscuit tin, scratched and dusty. Poirot opened it with the care of a surgeon. Inside were 3 key items: a second ledger, identical in make to the one Jasper Monkton had shown; a series of legal documents bearing the names Peregrine, Durand, and Rathbone; and folded at the bottom a typed confession. Poirot read it silently, his face unreadable. Then, as he reached the final paragraph, his eyes narrowed. "She writes well," he said softly. "Eleanor?" Hastings asked. "No," Poirot said. "Penelope?" He turned and held up the confession, offering it to Lomax. "She wrote this under duress, I think. But she wrote it as her final defense. She admits forging entries. She admits moving funds from Peregrine family accounts into shell companies linked to Eleanor Durand's holdings. And she names her father as the one who authorized the initial transfer. A single check from 1947, the very one he denied knowledge of." Lomax took the paper grimly. "So the colonel lied." "Mais oui. He did not merely lie, he enabled it, and then, when it grew dangerous, he withdrew, hoping silence would shield them all. Back in Levenham, as the day slid into evening and the mist thickened into rain, Poirot requested that Colonel Rathbone be brought to the inn's parlour. He arrived reluctantly, his greatcoat soaked, the lines on his face deeper than ever. "Colonel," Poirot began, "you are a soldier. You understand the cost of loyalty, of secrecy. You have paid for both." Rathbone stood with his cane unmoving. "I don't know what you mean." Poirot nodded toward Hastings, who handed him the tin. "Your daughter has named you. She claims you. Signed the initial check. That you allowed the transfer of funds from Peregrine family holdings. That you facilitated the creation of a trust used by Miss Durand to launder thousands." The colonel's jaw tightened. "I did not know the full extent, but you knew it was wrong," Poirot said gently. "And now a man is dead." Rathbone exhaled. "Arthur ruined Eleanor. She came to me with a plan. She said she could rebuild her life, recover what was taken. She only needed the signature. One, just one, to make the chain legitimate. And the money? I told myself it was a loan. I told myself a great many things. But she had leverage, Poirot. Letters, evidence. I'd done things I couldn't explain. Eleanor could ruin me. Or your daughter. That, at last, broke him. His voice cracked. She was just a girl, 22. I thought I was protecting her. Poirot stood. You protected her into a crime, and now she has nearly died for it." There was silence. Then Rathbone sat heavily in the chair near the fire, staring into the flames. "What happens now?" he asked. Poirot stepped closer. "You will sign a full statement. You will surrender every letter, check, and communication that connects you to this scheme, and you will testify against Eleanor Durand." Rathbone looked up. "And Penelope?" Poirot's voice softened. "If she recovers, she may yet have a chance at grace." Late that night, Poirot stood once more at Penelope's bedside. She had not woken, but the colour had returned faintly to her cheeks. He adjusted the corner of her blanket and spoke low. "Your father has confessed, and you, mademoiselle, must now choose whether you will continue to protect those who have abandoned you, or whether you will stand finally for yourself." He paused. "Because Eleanor Durand, she is not finished. Not yet." And outside, in the rain-soaked streets of Levenham, a woman in a grey coat passed unnoticed beneath a flickering street lamp, her eyes fixed on the lighted window of the room above the apothecary. Then, without a word, she turned and vanished into the night. The next morning broke with a brittle coldness that made even the inn's stout walls feel unsteady. Poirot sat alone in the breakfast-room, untouched tea cooling at his elbow, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The note from Penelope remained in his pocket. He had read it again before dressing, though its words had not changed. It was not the letter itself that occupied his mind, but the silence around it. Eleanor Durand had not yet made her next move, and that, Poirot knew, was her most dangerous position. Hastings entered quietly, rubbing his hands together. "Penelope is awake. The doctor says she'll recover, but it will take time." Poirot nodded. "Bon, and what of her memory?" "She remembers," Hastings said, "but she hasn't said much. Barely spoke at all." "Grief does that," Poirot murmured. "But guilt speaks even louder, eventually." He rose, brushing imaginary dust from his lapel. "It is time, mon ami. We must set the trap." Hastings looked startled. "A trap?" Poirot's eyes glinted. "You see, we have followed the clues. We have peeled back the layers. But Eleanor, she is not one to surrender simply because the evidence draws near. No, she needs to be shown that her carefully designed illusion has failed, that her silence has not protected her. Only then will she emerge." "And what do you propose?" Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "We shall hold a gathering, this evening, here, in the parlour, all involved, Rathbone, Miss Darrow, Monckton, and if she is able, Penelope. We present what we know, not as accusation, but as certainty. You think Eleanor will come? I think she will not be able to stay away." By midday, preparations had begun. Lomax was informed. The constables stationed discreetly. Word was sent to each party that Poirot wished to present his conclusions, and that their attendance was not requested but expected. There was no mention of Eleanor. At 7:05, they assembled in the parlour of the Briar Rose Inn. Colonel Rathbone stood near the window, hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. Sylvia Darrow sat near the hearth, looking pale but resolute. Monckton hovered by the sideboard, visibly sweating. And Penelope, thinner, fragile, her head bandaged beneath a pale scarf, had insisted on being brought down in a chair, her voice barely more than a whisper. Poirot entered last, followed by Hastings and Lomax. He paused only briefly at the door, then stepped into the centre of the room and surveyed the circle around him. "Mes amis," he said quietly, "you know why we are here." No one spoke. Poirot continued. "A man is dead, Mr. Arthur Peregrine, killed aboard the 6:30 train from King's Cross in a locked compartment, with no weapon found and no witness to the act. What at first seemed a mystery of mechanics, how the killer entered and left, has proved to be a question rather of timing and precision. He turned slightly toward Colonel Rathbone. Colonel, you signed a check in 1947 that began a chain of concealed transactions, money intended for Miss Lillian Peregrine, redirected through shell accounts, and eventually appearing in an offshore trust under the guidance of Eleanor Durand. You knew, and you remained silent. Rathbone flinched, but did not respond. Poirot faced Monckton. Mr. Monckton, you handled the documents. Perhaps you were deceived at first, but eventually you suspected. And when Peregrine asked you to help him expose the fraud, you hesitated. You allowed him to proceed alone. Monckton stammered. I was afraid. Oui. And Mademoiselle Darrow, you knew of the letters Peregrine had received. You warned him in your own way, but you did not confront the danger head-on. Sylvia lowered her eyes. Poirot turned to Penelope. His voice softened. And you, mademoiselle? You were drawn in, first by Eleanor's charm, then by your father's example, and finally by your own fear. But you tried, in the end, to undo what you could, and nearly lost your life for it. Penelope said nothing. Her eyes filled, but she did not blink. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands. The truth is now clear. The financial scheme, the motive, even the method of murder. The window opened as the train slowed near Market Denley, the precise strike delivered from outside, and the careful placement of a clue, the handkerchief embroidered with initials. A signature. He paused, then said the name aloud. Eleanor Durand. There was a beat of stillness, no movement, no gasp, until a voice spoke, quiet and calm. Well, I do hope you've rehearsed the ending, monsieur. It's such a shame when the final act disappoints. Every head turned. She stood in the doorway, dressed in grey, unremarkable, pale gloves, glistening from the rain, her coat buttoned to the throat. And yet, there was nothing nondescript about her. Her eyes, cool and deliberate, moved across the room like chess pieces. Poirot bowed his head. Mademoiselle Durand? Eleanor stepped into the light. No need for dramatics. I received your message, Monsieur Poirot, though I admit I expected more subtlety. You mean the invitation left at the tobacconist's? She gave a small smile. A clever touch, but unnecessary. I've been listening for days. Hastings stiffened. Lomax stepped forward, but Poirot lifted a hand. No, let her speak. Eleanor glanced around the room, at Penelope, at Rathbone, at Monckton, even at Sylvia. How loyal you all are now, she said. Curious that none of you were so loyal when it mattered. Poirot said, You came here with a plan. To kill Peregrine, yes, but also to unnerve, to expose the guilt in others without ever speaking a word yourself. Eleanor's smile widened. He took everything from me, my position, my future, my credibility. He buried me with forged numbers and a whisper campaign. Do you know what it's like to be erased, and then to watch, quietly, as those who aided him went on to comfortable lives? Poirot stepped closer. You planned it all, the timing, the slowing of the train, the brief window of movement between stations. You knew his habit of locking the door. You struck, and then you vanished. She met his gaze without flinching. I told him once that I would repay him, with interest. And the attempt on Penelope's life? Eleanor tilted her head. She betrayed me. I was kind to her. I trusted her, but in the end, like the rest, she clung to the power that protected her. She thought handing you a note would absolve her. It will not. Poirot said quietly, You are wrong. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Poirot turned. Because it is not silence that protects the powerful. It is impunity. But once that is broken, once one person stands and says no more, the illusion fails. Penelope stirred. Her voice cracked but carried. I was afraid. but I don't want to be anymore." Eleanor blinked, just once. Lomax stepped forward now. "Eleanor Durand, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Arthur Peregrine, and for the attempted murder of Penelope Rathbone." Eleanor said nothing. Her hands remained at her sides. She did not resist as the cuffs were placed around her wrists. As she was led to the door, she turned her head only once, toward Poirot. "No one will remember him kindly," she said. Poirot inclined his head. "That, mademoiselle, is not for me to decide." And then she was gone. The room remained still for a long moment. The rain pattered gently against the window pane. The fire hissed. Poirot turned to the others, voice quiet. "It is over." Hastings exhaled slowly. "Do you think she regrets it?" "No," Poirot said. "But perhaps she regrets what she lost before she ever struck the blow." He picked up his hat from the table and adjusted it carefully. "Come, Hastings. The train to London waits for no one." And outside, the mist was lifting at last. The journey back to London was subdued. Poirot sat with his back perfectly straight, his gloved hands folded neatly on his lap. He had said very little since boarding the 3:15 express, but Hastings knew better than to mistake his silence for detachment. Poirot's silences were never idle. They were, as always, filled with deduction. Across from him, Hastings stared out the window at the passing countryside. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, casting the fields in a silvery veil. After a time he spoke. "Do you think she'll confess fully?" Poirot's gaze remained fixed on some distant point beyond the glass. "Eleanor Durand? Number not fully. She has already confessed to herself. That is the most dangerous kind. But the words, they will be careful, legal, calculated. She will speak just enough to shape her image, to control the narrative. She is not a woman who surrenders freely." "But she didn't run," Hastings said. "She came to the gathering." "Oui," Poirot replied. "She wanted to control the ending, even then." Hastings turned slightly. "I still can't decide whether I pity her or fear her." Poirot gave a faint smile. "You may do both. The one does not cancel the other." The train rattled softly as it curved through a forested stretch. Poirot reached into his coat and withdrew the folded letter, Penelope's letter, once more. He looked at it for a moment, then tucked it away again. "I have thought," he said slowly, "of the final line. I only wanted to be free. It is not guilt that haunts her, Hastings. It is entrapment, first by Eleanor, then by her father, then by silence. And this is the truth at the center of so many crimes, not wickedness, but entrapment." Hastings frowned. "She could have spoken out at any time." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Could she? And who would have believed her, eh? The daughter of a colonel, the friend of a disgraced woman, the associate of men accused of fraud. You see, mon ami, it is easy to say what one would do from the safety of distance, but when shame wraps itself around fear, people become very still." The compartment fell silent again. The countryside slipped past. When they arrived at Paddington, a car was waiting, courtesy of Scotland Yard. Inside was a file already prepared for Poirot, transcripts from Eleanor's preliminary interview, copies of the ledger entries recovered from Market Denley, and a fresh detail, a small parcel found in her rented room behind the tobacconist. Poirot opened the parcel on the drive. Inside was a gold fountain pen, a silver compact mirror, and a single calling card, Eleanor Durand. But what struck him most was the mirror. Its back was engraved, a line of poetry etched with precision. "I am not what I seem." Poirot stared at the inscription, his brow furrowing. Curious? A line from a forgotten poem, or perhaps not so forgotten. Hastings peered over. "What does it mean?" Poirot tapped the card. "It means she had one more game in play." Back at Whitehall, Poirot was escorted to a small interview room where Eleanor Durand sat alone, her wrists no longer cuffed, her posture immaculate. She looked up as he entered and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Monsieur Poirot?" He inclined his head. "Mademoiselle Durand?" She studied him for a moment, then gestured to the seat opposite. "I assume you've come for a final confession?" "Non," Poirot said, lowering himself into the chair. "I have come for clarity." Eleanor crossed her legs. "There is a difference?" "Oh, oui. A confession is what you give to the law. Clarity is what you owe to yourself." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Very philosophical. And what clarity do you seek?" Poirot placed the compact mirror gently on the table between them. "You left this, intentionally." She looked at it, unreadable. "Did I?" "It bears an inscription, one you selected. I am not what I seem. You want to be misunderstood, but why?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "Because if I am understood, then I am vulnerable." Poirot gave a small nod. "You wish to be myth, a story, something whispered about over dinner, a woman too clever, too wronged, too mysterious to be known." She looked at him now, eyes sharper. "And isn't that precisely what you want from me?" Poirot smiled. "No, mademoiselle, I want the truth." She laughed, once dryly. "Truth? You already have it. You know I killed Arthur. You know why. You know about the money, the betrayal, the vanished years. But not about the other letter." Her expression changed, subtly, but enough. Poirot continued. "In the ledger, there is a missing page, torn at the root. Penelope did not remove it. You did." He placed a folded sheet on the table, reconstructed from the imprint on the following page. Hastings and the Yard had recovered it earlier that day. It read, "To be opened only if he refuses. Then you'll have no choice, but not before. Let him explain. If he can't, then you strike, but only then." Eleanor's hands twitched slightly. Poirot's voice lowered. "You gave him one last chance. You didn't intend to kill him, not unless he failed you again. You boarded that train with the blade, but not the certainty." She stared at the paper, her face unreadable. Then slowly, her voice emerged. "He didn't open the door." Poirot waited. "I waited outside the compartment window for 2 minutes. I knocked gently. I waited, but he didn't move. He saw me, I'm sure of it, just stared. He knew what I was there for, and he didn't move." Poirot folded his hands. He condemned himself. She exhaled. "So I did what I promised." A pause. Then she looked up. "Do you think that makes me human again?" Poirot's expression softened. "It makes you known again." They sat in silence for a time, the only sound the faint tapping of rain against the glass beyond. When Poirot finally stood, he looked down at her with quiet gravity. "You were wrong about one thing, mademoiselle. The final act did not disappoint." And without another word, he left her there, alone, but not unknowable. Outside, Hastings waited. "What did she say?" Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Enough!" Hastings hesitated. "Do you believe her?" Poirot stepped into the grey light of the courtyard. "I believe she waited for him to open the door, and he didn't." They reached the steps leading towards Scotland Yard. Poirot paused. "But more importantly, I believe she is done." Hastings frowned. "What makes you so sure?" Poirot glanced once more at the mirror in his hand, the words engraved across its back. She left no room for a sequel. The days that followed were quiet, though the air around Whitehall carried the slow burn of something unresolved. Eleanor Durand remained in custody, awaiting formal charges. Her barrister had requested a psychiatric evaluation, a subtle effort, Poirot noted, to begin the process of softening her public image. But it was unlikely to succeed. The papers had already caught scent of the affair, and headlines swelled with phrases like, The Lady Behind the Glass, and Train Murder, Locked Room, Unlocked Motive. Sensationalism thrived, and as Poirot knew too well, public opinion did not pause for nuance. And yet, something about it still unsettled him. He reviewed the files again, late into the evening, the ledgers, the red tin, the typed confession, the note Penelope had written, the torn page they had reconstructed, everything aligned, too neatly. On the third evening, as rain drummed against his windows and the city glowed dull and shapeless beneath the fog, Poirot lit a single lamp, pulled his chair close to the fire, and returned to a question he had not allowed himself to dwell upon until now. Why had Eleanor waited? Not how she had killed. That much was now clear. Not why. The trail of financial ruin, betrayal, and silence explained that well enough. But why then? Why that day, that train, that moment? He tapped a finger against the armrest. "Monsieur Peregrine," he murmured aloud, "you did not open the door. But did you expect her?" He stood abruptly and crossed to his desk, retrieving the original copy of the letter Eleanor had left for Penelope to deliver, the one she had never handed him, the one he had read weeks too late. He unfolded it again, this time paying attention not to its content, but to its form. The creases, the handwriting, the smudge of ink at the top corner, not from careless writing, but from pressure, the kind one makes when placing something heavy on the paper. A paperweight? Number. It was too isolated, too precise. He opened the compact mirror once again, the one Eleanor had left behind, and looked at its base. There it was, a tiny fleck of dried ink. He sat back down slowly. "You placed the mirror on the letter, mademoiselle, but why? Unless—" He reached for his lamp and tilted it sideways. He slipped the page beneath the light and ran his fingertips over it. There, beneath the ink, a faint indentation, not words but a shape, circular, etched like a seal. He fetched a pencil and gently shaded across the top half of the page. A symbol emerged, the monogram, R.P. Poirot's lips pressed together. R.P. not Peregrine, not Penelope, but Reginald Price. The name rang distantly, not from this case, but from a financial scandal 5 years prior. A small firm in Paddington had collapsed. Funds had vanished. A scandal, no proof. Price had disappeared. But the initials, the connections, they now stood out like blood on white linen. He stood again, this time not to pace. "Bon," he said aloud. Then the ending was never hers to write. He called Hastings. By 9 the next morning, they stood once more in front of the Briar Rose Inn, where the threads had first begun to tangle. Hastings looked confused. "I thought it was over," he said, as they approached the entry. "Eleanor confessed. The evidence lines up. Penelope survived. What more could there be?" Poirot gave a small shake of the head. "That is precisely the problem, Hastings. It lines up too well. Nothing in life lines up so cleanly. Not without guidance." They stepped inside, and Poirot went directly to the innkeeper. "Pardon, madame," he said, "but I require your guest book for the week leading up to Peregrine's death." The woman blinked, but complied. She returned with a slim, leather-bound volume. Poirot turned through it slowly. 3 pages.
Intense that it strips away the planet's upper atmosphere, tearing it off into space. The planet is bleeding, constantly, its gases trailing behind it in a long tail, not unlike the tails of comets, but composed of vaporized metals and hydrogen. This loss is gradual, but significant. Kelt 9b is being eroded, molecule by molecule. If the orbit remains stable, and the star continues its unrelenting assault, the planet may eventually be stripped down to its core, a bare, burned remnant drifting alone in radiation. Now pause, feel that shift, from a planet that swallows light to one that suffocates under too much of it, from darkness so complete it's eerie to brightness so brutal it melts identity. Both are terrifying, not because they are aggressive, but because they are utterly indifferent to what we consider tolerable. These aren't hostile in the way predators are. They are hostile in the way space is, immense, unmoved, unsuited for anything shaped like us. And still we study them. Why? Because every time we peer into such extremes, we expand the boundaries of what a planet can be. We stretch our models, we rewrite our expectations, we remember that our world, this small blue breathable orb, is not the norm. It is the miracle. Truist 2b reminds us that darkness isn't just absence, it can be presence. A rich, thick silence in the spectrum, and Celt 9b shows us that heat, when pushed to its edge, doesn't just burn, it breaks the rules. Together these two worlds paint a portrait of extremes, a universe that holds places so outside our comfort zone they feel more like thought experiments than realities, and yet they are real. They orbit, they move, they endure. You'll never go there, you wouldn't survive a second. But by imagining them, you've touched something vast, something strange, and something that, in its quiet way, is still part of your night sky. Somewhere out there, right now, Truist 2b is passing like a ghost in front of its star. Invisible, except for a flicker. And Celt 9b is glowing like a coal that never cools, bleeding gas into the vacuum with every heartbeat of its orbit. They don't know we're watching, but we are. And maybe in knowing them, we come to know the edges of what is possible, and the quiet, improbable space we call home. Among all the strange and impossible places we've visited so far, there is something especially haunting about a planet that is not simply uninhabitable, but is actively being unmade. Not by explosion, not by some dramatic celestial event, but by the slow, steady appetite of its own sun. The planet is called WASP-12b, and though it may sound like a scientific code tucked away in a forgotten database, its story is far more poetic than its name suggests. WASP-12 is a gas giant much like Jupiter, yet larger, puffier, and far less fortunate in its relationship with its star. It orbits extremely close to its host, so close.
Not entirely. One piece remained missing, and Poirot, ever patient, ever exacting, was already turning the first page of what would be the sequel Eleanor Durand never intended to leave. The fog that had blanketed London for 3 days began to lift the next morning, revealing the city not renewed, but merely unmasked. In the grey light of early dawn, Hercule Poirot sat by the window of his flat, a single envelope before him, unopened. He had received it late the night before. No return address, but the hand that had written his name on the front was unmistakable. Clean, curved, and measured, Eleanor Durand's script. The letter had passed through official hands, approved by the constabulary after inspection. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal. But Poirot had waited until morning, as he always did when something needed to be seen in the clear light of day. He broke the seal delicately. Inside was a single sheet, the writing small but precise. Monsieur Poirot, you were right, of course, about Price, about his hand in this. But you must understand, he was not the shadow behind the curtain. He was the mirror. I saw what I might become, and I walked toward it anyway. He never pushed. He only waited for me to choose. You'll never find him if you look for the criminal. Find him where the money rests, where the silence is most useful. There he will be. As for me, I did not tell you everything. There is one more account. I buried it deeper than the rest, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I was afraid of what it meant. You'll find it tied to an estate in Waltham Heath. Look for the name de Laurent. He used it once. So did I. Tell Penelope that she was never part of the plan. She was the one thing I didn't expect. Edie Poirot read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and set it beside his teacup. There was no bitterness in the words, nor self-pity, just finality, the kind that came not from defeat, but from acceptance. Waltham Heath, de Laurent, another name, another mask. He did not waste the morning. Within 2 hours, he and Hastings were in the outskirts of Waltham Heath, standing before a modest brick house that had once served as a registrar's office. The building was now quiet, its windows shuttered, though a new mailbox stood outside bearing no name. Inside, after some effort and a few words from Inspector Lomax, who had arrived shortly after Poirot's request, they entered the rear archive room. It smelled of ink and dry paper. Everything inside was ordered, quiet, and untouched. Hastings helped lift down the file boxes from the D to L section. They worked in silence until Poirot held up a slim binder marked De Laurent Special Trust. He opened it. There were 4 entries, all dated between 1948 and 1953. The first 2 showed transfers from estates owned by now-defunct family holdings. The third bore the name of Reginald Price. The fourth, Eleanor Durand. But what stopped Poirot was not the pattern of names. It was the 5th page, one not listed in the index. He turned it slowly. It was a signed authorization of withdrawal, dated 6 months prior to Peregrine's death. Amount £17,000. Destination: holding account, Ravenstone Trust, Switzerland. Authorized by Peregrine A. Hastings leaned in. But that doesn't make sense. Peregrine moved the funds. Poirot's brows drew together. No, Hastings. He was made to appear as though he had. He flipped back to the signatures on other forms, then looked at this one again. See here. The loop of the G, the slope of the A. It is not Peregrine's writing. It is familiar. Hastings blinked. You don't think? Poirot nodded. Penelope. There was a long pause. Then Hastings said quietly, but she was trying to break away. Oui, Poirot said. She wanted out. But perhaps not completely. Not until the end. They returned to London that evening, under a sky of flat blue-grey. Back at Poirot's flat, Hastings sat heavily by the fire, while Poirot studied the signature again beneath his desk lamp. He made several notations, then picked up the phone. Operator, he said crisply, please connect me with Miss Penelope Rathbone at the residence of Colonel Hugh Rathbone, Kensington Park Lane. After a moment, a voice answered. It was her. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, I wonder if I might trouble you with one final visit. This evening. It will not take long. She hesitated. Of course. Shall I come to you? If you please. She arrived an hour later, looking thinner than before, but stronger. No bandages now. Her voice held calm. She sat opposite him in the same chair Eleanor had once filled during that final interview. And perhaps she noticed, for she shifted only once before settling. I thought this was over, she said. Poirot smiled. So did I. But it appears, mademoiselle, that the past is not yet finished with us. He slid the ledger page toward her. Do you recognize this signature? She looked at it, and for the smallest fraction of a second, something in her expression changed. Poirot caught it. The inhale before speech. No, she said. Should I? Poirot folded his hands. You signed it, mademoiselle. You authorized the withdrawal of funds from the Ravenstone Trust under Peregrine's name. You were trying to retrieve what you believed was Eleanor's share, were you not? Her eyes dropped. She did not answer at once. Poirot waited. I thought I could return it quietly, she said at last. After everything. After he was gone. It was meant to correct what he had done. She asked me for one last favour, and I owed her that, or thought I did. Poirot's voice remained soft. You were not alone in this. Price was involved, and perhaps Eleanor hoped to expose him eventually. But you still thought you could balance the scale. Penelope's voice trembled. I never wanted to take it. I only wanted to give back what was stolen. Poirot nodded. And yet the law will not care about intentions, mademoiselle. It sees the ink, not the hand. She looked up then, her eyes clear. So what happens now? Poirot stood slowly, walking to the window. That depends, he said, on whether you are willing to testify. She looked startled. Testify? Against whom? Poirot turned. Not against Eleanor, against Price. You knew him. You saw him in Levenham. You recognized the danger. And if we are to bring him in, to truly end this, we will need your words. She was quiet, but not unsure. I will, she said. Poirot gave a small bow. Then I believe, mademoiselle, that your second chance has begun. She left quietly, without fanfare, and when the door closed behind her, Poirot looked once more at the window, at the darkening London skyline. The affair of the 6:30 from King's Cross was nearly closed, but one man still ran free, and Poirot, the little Belgian with the meticulous moustaches and the mind like clockwork, was already narrowing the compass of a world that, for Reginald Price, was beginning to shrink. 10 days later, under a sky brushed with pale winter light, Hercule Poirot stood on the stone platform of Laussane's central station, his gloved hand curled tightly around the silver handle of his cane. A thin wind rolled off Lake Geneva, crisp and clean, stirring the hem of his overcoat. Hastings stood beside him, breath visible in the morning chill, clutching the final page of the wire from Scotland Yard. They confirmed it, Hastings said, shaking his head. He rented a chalet under the name Roland Paris, passport forged, accounts inactive, but he'd set it up months ago, even before Peregrine's murder. Poirot nodded, eyes scanning the scattering of travellers disembarking from the arriving express. He had known for days now that Reginald Price would resurface here, not because of the trust accounts or the signatures or even Eleanor's final letter, but because of the pattern. Men like Price always circled back to the place where they believed they had secured a future, where they had buried the past in numbers and false names. Switzerland was not just a haven for bank accounts. It was a mirror, cold, unyielding, and precise. The man appeared exactly as Poirot had envisioned, slightly older than in the last photograph, with the same narrow shoulders, the same posture of a man who always walked half a step ahead of his own guilt. He carried a valise and wore a charcoal coat with a green scarf tucked smartly beneath the collar, a touch too polished, too careful. Poirot stepped forward. "Monsieur Price," he said without raising his voice. The man paused, then turned slowly. For a brief second he wore a smile, that bland, courteous expression of someone pretending not to recognize the hunter at the gate. "I'm afraid you have the wrong man." "But of course," Poirot said gently, "because the man I seek has many names, Laurent, Paxton, and once, simply Price. But what he cannot change, not with all the ink and paper in the world, is the shape of his fear when he is seen." The smile faded. Poirot continued, "You knew Eleanor would take the fall. You let her plan the strike, knowing it would shield your greater crime. You even tried to remove Penelope when she came too close, when she remembered too much. But in the end, you made the same mistake they all make." Price's eyes narrowed. "And what is that?" "You believed the mind that untangled Eleanor's scheme could not untangle yours." Two Swiss officers stepped forward behind Poirot. Price's hands tensed at his sides. "I didn't kill Peregrine," he said flatly. "No," Poirot agreed, "but you created the world in which it became inevitable." That was the truth at the core of it. Price had moved through the lives of his co-conspirators like a shadow through a lantern, invisible unless one looked directly at the light. Eleanor had been a wounded mind seeking justice. Penelope, a loyal friend chasing restitution. But Price, he had wanted only silence, and he had paid for it with other people's futures. As the officers placed him in custody, Poirot turned away. He and Hastings boarded the return train just before noon. The landscape slipped past in shades of silver and pine, and neither spoke for some time. At last, Hastings leaned back in his seat. "Do you believe Penelope will be all right?" Poirot looked out the window, thoughtful. "She has chosen truth. It is never the easiest path, but it is the only one with a destination." "And Eleanor?" Poirot was silent a moment. Then, "She gave up vengeance before we ever arrived. The letter was her surrender. Not to us, but to herself. Her story ends behind walls, yes, but she will have peace." Hastings folded his arms. "I suppose it's rare, isn't it, for all the pieces to fit in the end?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong, mon ami. The pieces always fit. One must simply know what picture they were meant to form." The train curved toward the south, the mountains rising faintly in the distance. Another case closed, another knot unraveled. And as the rhythm of the rails lulled the afternoon into quiet, Hercule Poirot, meticulous, patient, and ever precise, closed his eyes and allowed himself, just for a moment, to rest.